Praise be to Jesus Christ, and welcome to Catholic Forum. I'm your guest host, Alan Dunst, and we want to thank you for being with us today. And we hope that our conversation here in West Michigan finds you wherever you are and draws you closer to Jesus Christ through His one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Normally, we like to have our shows be somewhat timeless because we never know when people are actually going to watch them on the internet or on their local cable station. But today, we're going to kind of tell you definitely where we are in time. We've just started Lent in 2016, which happens to be the middle of a Jubilee of Year of Mercy declared by Pope Francis. And so we are going to take advantage of this season of grace to discuss the Sacrament of Confession. And this is one of the, the unsung heroes of the Catholic Church, and has kind of fallen into disuse over the years. And we want to kind of talk about why that is and what we can do to maybe turn that around a little bit and appreciate better this sacrament. And I can think of no one better to help us do that than Father Peter Damian of Sacred Heart of Jesus Catholic Church in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Thank you so much for being with us.
Good evening. Thank you for having me again.
Well, we'd love to have you here, so you're always invited back. So I started, I've kind of I started with a little downer, right? The Sacrament of Confession or Penance or Reconciliation, several names for it, is not used as much as it should and could be.
Yes. Catholics, at best, most Catholics have heard about it, and probably they remember their first confession. But no matter how you call it, it's still, that is what it is that unique encounter of grace, individual encounter with God through the person of the priest, in which we bring all our sinfulness in front of God's mercy, God's love. And we know that the Lord, as He said to the apostles, and He mandated the apostles to do, the Lord will forgive those sins to those who admit them and are willing to start again a new life. So the Sacrament of Reconciliation, unfortunately, is probably the most forgotten sacrament among the sacraments of the Church. I looked at some statistics. Georgetown University has a special center who they conduct various research in church practice, and one of these attracted my attention particularly to confession. And it says that this research has been done a few years back. So it's related to 2009, 2012, and it says that only 12% of Catholics go to confession at least once a year, which is the minimum that the Church prescribes for a Catholic. Many Catholics do not know that the Catholic Church requires at least to go to confession once a year and to receive communion at least once a year. This decree was given by the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. Unfortunately, some people, non-Catholics, sometimes say that the Catholic Church invented the Sacrament of Reconciliation in the Middle Ages, which that's not the case, absolutely. What the Church did in the Middle Ages was to mandate to go to confession at least once a year and to receive communion at least once a year. But unfortunately, the statistics are very dismal. And so basically 1 in 10 Catholics only abides by the Church teaching in this matter. It's even among those who go to communion, 45%, according to those statistics, of those who receive communion, so of those people who consider themselves practicing Catholics, 45%, almost half, have never gone to confession after their first confession.
Wow.
I think that is a very sad reality. But this is the reality we deal with, and I hope tonight some people are listening and will be taking these words to heart and consider doing something, changing something about this.
Well, hopefully our conversation will touch on a couple things that will kind of draw them closer to that. But let's talk about some of the reasons why the sacrament has fallen into disuse. One of the things that we've heard about is this sense of a loss of a sense of sin. And maybe surprisingly, I've got a quote here from Pope Pius XII, so more than a half century ago, more than 50 years ago, said, the tragedy of our age was that it had lost its sense of sin, the awareness of sin. And that's, I think, pretty evident.
Yes, absolutely. Isn't that surprising when you think we see it in our age? We see how people, many people do not have a sense of sin. Even the word sin has fallen into disuse, and if you say it, people will look at you oddly. Here's this Bible Christian, talking.
Right.
But although sin is not just something that just Christians do, it's a universal experience. So if Pope Pius XII said that, and that was, he was the Pope of World War II, and you look at World War II, you look at the worst, you look at evil in the world, you realize, how is that possible that people, they have lost the sense of sin, but sin is still there, and evil is still at work, and it was in his time. And actually, Pope Francis quoted Pope Pius XII on this. If that was the case almost a century ago, nowadays it's much worse. And I think one of the reasons for that is cultural relativism. Relativism is one of the illnesses of our age. In poor words, relativism is about there is no objective truth. Everything, what is truth, what is good, depends on what I think is good or true or evil, or everything depends on the subject, on me, and what I think. Everything is opinion. There is nothing objective, nothing that we should abide by. And most of the people probably they won't say it in these terms, but that's kind of how many people think. There are some fundamental truths that they believe, but unfortunately, this is how kind of people live. Most of people live with this mentality, and we see it in the political correctness in our age. We see how much that is present, and we see even in the presidential campaign, some of the successes are because people realize there's some truth about this kind of, we have fallen into political correctness. And people are afraid to say things that they think, and to uphold things that we see it in the truth related to marriage, we see it in the truth related to life, to the beginning and end of life, from natural conception to natural death. We see it in so many areas. This is one of the reasons why people do not feel the need for confession, because they feel they absolve themselves. They don't see the need to say, I'm sorry, to come to God in the person of the priest and say, I am sorry, I have done this, this, and this. They kind of absolve themselves, unfortunately, and that's just illusion. That's not getting rid of sin.
Right. And another thing culturally I think we might point out is that even though working kind of in tandem with the relativism, which doesn't see an absolute, is we've also kind of nurtured a culture where the esteem is kind of given so much precedent. We've become so subjective that our esteem is very, almost like a glass doll, that it's very fragile. And so brooking the idea of sin is like an affront to who I am, because part of it is because we've lost a sense of our dignity as sons and daughters of God. And so we look toward others to give us that validation that we should have just by who we are, and that dignity that we have just by being, born, or even be conceived, let's say.
Yes.
Because some people lose that, even that sense of it. And instead, we look to others, and so everyone has to have a trophy, and no one can admit they're wrong. And so coming to stand before somebody else, especially, and say that I've had weakness, I've failed, and is really difficult in some ways.
Yes. In regards to, so you said coming to someone and saying, I've done this and that, and this is in the case of a Catholic is the priest. First of all, from the perspective of the priest, let me tell you that a priest is there. A priest gives his whole life to God to serve the people of God, and the priest is there to help you come back to God. It's one of the greatest joy for a priest to witness on behalf of God in the confessional, to witness the person's desire to come back to God fully, and the person that is sorry for what they have done. So if someone is afraid of coming to confession, let me tell you that shouldn't be the case at all. I know of no priest that would treat you badly because you come to confession, and certainly God doesn't treat you badly because of that. And going into the aspect of esteem, I think yes, our esteem, our identity comes from realizing that we are sons and daughters of God, and we are loved, and we are important. We are persons. We're not objects. We are persons. So we have a unique dignity as sons and daughters of God, and this is all human persons enjoy that dignity. But having said that, one of the things that speaks to this age, to our people, I think it's an analogy that I very much like, that Matthew Kelly uses in his books, and I would like to recommend, for example, Rediscover Catholicism. It's one of the books in which he points to confession as one of the 7 pillars of Catholicism. Mm-hmm. And he makes an analogy with sports. He says, he looks at 2 sportsmen, and he says, one of they have been so successful because they were able to look at their weaknesses and to work on them. And that is, so looking at your weaknesses and admitting your weaknesses actually makes you stronger. I think that is something that everyone can get. Mm-hmm. Even if you have lost the sense of sin, if we talk in terms of weaknesses and areas where you are not as you should be, I think that is a comparison that can help us realize. And in all areas of life, we see people that are successful not because they are perfect, but because they recognize what is not working and what should be done, and they work on that. So there's that moment of truth that in the confession happens, and we prepare when we go to confession. We already have that moment of truth and analyze ourselves. Mm-hmm. So that's not losing actually the esteem. That's actually gaining the right esteem, because it's false. If we build our esteem on a lie, it's a house built on sand, as the Lord puts it. Mm-hmm. But if we build the house, if we build ourselves, if we let the Lord build us on solid ground, and that solid ground is, the truth, admitting that we're not perfect, we're not God.
Right.
That is, I think, the right way of building a sense of esteem.
Yeah, I heard it. Someone refer to it as people tend to nowadays compare themselves to Hitler instead of Jesus, and can say, I'm not a bad person because I haven't killed, I haven't murdered, I haven't stolen from everybody, I'm not that bad. But they forget that our real standard of behavior and of grace and of love of God is Jesus.
Yes.
And so kind of gotta...
Yeah, well, sometimes people, and I've met quite a few people like that they are reluctant to come to confession because they feel, I haven't killed anyone, I haven't worshipped idols, so, I'm okay. And you pointed that comparison is right, because we should compare ourselves to Christ. Did I love like Christ? Did I behave like Christ would have behaved in this and this and this situation? Was I, in Matthew Calley's words, the best version of myself? The best version that I could be and that God wants me to be? Was I that in this and this and this case?
Right.
I think if we asked ourselves, if we asked that question in this way, we'd realize that actually we need to go to confession. And it's not true that, I'm not that bad of a person.
Right.
That's a prideful thought, and it's also not realizing our relationship with God, and I think there's much that turns around that concept, that understanding of relationship with God.
Right.
Is an erroneous idea of God's mercy. And that is something else that the Church always addressed, and Pope Francis addresses too. It's because if you just stop and think, well, why should one be merciful? Mercy is about forgiving, and if there's no fault, there's nothing to forgive, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so, if mercy naturally recalls and points at sin and fault and evil and so errors that we have committed. So these may be two opposite errors. One, not trusting enough God's mercy, and the opposite is presuming on God's mercy.
Right. And it's interesting, as I was preparing for this conversation, I ran across an article on the National Catholic Register by Deacon Nick Donnelly. It was actually named Year of Mercy Makes Sense Only If You Haven't Lost the Sense of Sin. And that sense that, we're highlighting God's mercy this year, but if you don't have that sense of sin, you really don't appreciate it. It's like Christ asked, who loves more, the one who's given much or forgiven little, right? And if you don't think you've got anything to be forgiven, well, how much do you love in return? This article was kind of noting that Pope Francis is kind of discerning between different types of characters, people who recognize sin and those that he calls corrupt, and they don't recognize the sin in their life anymore. And so the interviewer asked, how do we recognize that we ourselves are sinners, and what would you say to someone who doesn't feel like one? And he said, I would advise him to ask the grace of feeling like one. Just recognizing as a sinner is a grace. It is a grace that is granted to you.
Yes.
So
one of the big questions is that why don't people allow themselves to just stop with evil and change course? How is it that they keep growing in corruption? And I think one of the reasons is pride. Pride is one of them. Pride is one of the capital sins, and pride is one of those things that blocks you from seeing things as they are appropriately. It's hard to admit and to assess yourself correctly. So pride, I think, is one of the problems. And one of the things that helps, one of the practices of the Catholic faith is frequent confession. Is not required. The Church requires to go to confession at least once a year, but to go to confession often, it's a very good practice, because if you analyze yourself more often, you realize again which are your weaknesses, which are those areas that you need to do something about in your life. You will grow because you will work on those areas. So I think frequent confession can be a powerful tool to change one's life and to address that danger of falling into complacency and not even seeing after some time the big sins. It's like when your house is clean and tidy, you take care of it more. But when you start throwing things here and there, you don't pay attention anymore, and because the house doesn't look very clean, you keep throwing things and adding, like the car, how many things you throw in your car, and after some time you realize that has become a junkyard. and when you throw in bigger stuff,
sure,
you don't notice it anymore.
Right.
So I think frequent confession is one of those tools, spiritual tools that enables us to not to fall into that danger of self-complacency and keeping adding sins and bigger sins and losing the sense of sin.
Right. And I want to touch very briefly on one other aspect that some people may find, that makes them not going to confession as often as that, and that is that they get kind of maybe tied in the ritual or the formula, where in the church, like you said, it has these rules, and it kind of states the minimum, but what it's really trying to do is nurture a relationship. It's trying to give a guardrails to try to keep you on at least someone on the road to nurturing that relationship. But sometimes people go to the confession, they think, okay, I've got bless me Father for I have sinned, I've count up the sins, and then say X number of Hail Marys, and they're done. How do you kind of reframe that?
Yes, I would say that in the past, and I'm a young person, so I'm a young priest, so it's hard for me to know how things were 50, 60 years ago, But from what I hear and I see sometimes elderly with kind of that attitude, is that in the past I think the danger was legalism, a certain legalism, doing things this. And order is a good thing. And formulas, how many formulas we use in life and in interaction among people. If we had to reinvent everything from scratch, it would be hard. Our life is made of habits. There are habits in the church too. So the way we go to confession is important too. But there's a soul, there's a spirit in all that we shouldn't lose, and that's actually even through formulas, there's life and there's grace and there's the embrace of the Father that occurs there in the confessional. God's embrace is like in the parable of the prodigal son. God's embrace occurs mystically in that moment. So it's really, I always say to people when they come to confession, and especially to those who are kind of afraid to come to confession, is that, forget me, I'm not there. The priest is not there. You're telling your sins to God. I'm there on behalf of God. I'm like a witness there. So try to picture yourself in front of God. You go in front of God, like at the moment of judgment, on Judgment Day. What would you like to have said, to have repented on? And we know that God is a merciful judge, and this is why He gave us the grace of confession, such a sacrament like confession, and all the sacraments, by the way, they are means, God's means of reaching out to us and embracing us, bringing us back to Himself, and having us experience His love of a Father. That's, I think, that's warmth and that avoids any, I think, the danger of legalism. When you have that understanding of God, you have a relationship with God, that legalism fades away.
And we only have a few moments, but I want to have you talk a little bit about an examination of conscience. How would someone who's coming back to confession after a while, what would some ideas be for them to do a good examination of conscience?
Yes, that's very important. Some people have goodwill to come to confession, but they do a poor job about examining. And part of it is because they don't know where to look and what to. And there are many, there are flyers sometimes in the back of the church. In our church we have the Knights of Columbus rack and CD rack, and there are flyers about how to make a good confession. If you look even in the catechism and in prayer books, there are many guides. I have a book here, it's a small book, How to Make a Good Confession. Tools like these can help you, but I would go. There are a few methods that one could use. And obviously, so one of them is love of God and love of the neighbor. So to examine yourself based on that. Another one could be to examine your relationship with God, to examine your relationship with yourself, with your family, on your workplace, and in society at large. You could go about that. Another way and that probably was more traditional way about the Ten Commandments, but you don't stop at the Ten Commandments. You can go much deeper. For example, the commandments to respect the parents is you can go at large about your relationship with your family, not just about your parents. If you are a parent, probably haven't had the right relationship with your children and grandchildren and so forth. So I would say there are different ways of examination, and these are just a few that one could use. And I think there's no person that could say, well, my relationship with God is perfect, the best as it could be. There's nothing wrong between me and my wife, nothing wrong that I did in my family. There's everything is going perfect on my workplace. I've been the best that I could be. Really? I mean, if one looked at himself, you realize how. Or in society, I mean, we're in a year of elections, and even that in politics, in a democracy, if we have the power to elect, or sometimes if we run if we're candidates, we should live the faith in those areas too. So we have a responsibility. How I wonder how can a Catholic contribute to elect people that uphold policies openly in grave matters against your beliefs, against your the good of society, the common good. So even in those areas, we should confess these sins and try to address them.
Absolutely. Well, we're running out of time, but I want to thank you so much for being with us, Father.
Thank you very much. It's my joy.
It's wonderful. It's an important topic. I hope that people get something out of it, and that you see a few more people in the
confessional. Yes.
And we want to thank you for being with us for this conversation. We hope that it's been helpful to you, and that you may be hearing the call of God and through Jesus Christ, and to come closer to Him and be reconciled. So in the meantime, we hope that God will bless you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.